and welcome you all for this research seminar of Center for Wisdom and Leadership. Today we are very happy to welcome Professor Judith Glucke, who is a full professor of developmental psychology at University of Klagenfurt, Austria. Her main topic of research is, of course, wisdom, but more in wisdom, she is interested in manifestation of wisdom in real life, situational contextual factors that influence wise behavior, new approaches to measure wisdom, and even development of wisdom through interplay of life experiences and psychological resources and many more areas in wisdom. And she is a prolific author and has published multiple papers in this domain. She has held several research grants, and she was anyways talking about it during this conversation. And she has published papers in a lot of international journals. So we are very, very happy, and we welcome Professor Glucke. And she will be discussing about the wisdom researchers and the elephant, an integrative model of wise behavior. So we are looking forward to know more about it. So welcome back once again, and over to Professor Glucke for a seminar. We will have a talk followed by Q&A from the other participants. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess the first challenge is to share my screen, which would be, this one. Yes. Let's see if this works. So can you see my screen? Because for some reason,
yes, we can
I don't see it, but so what? Yeah, okay, no, fine, great. So let me just move on to this right place for myself. Okay, well, yeah, welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really nice to be virtually somewhere else right now. And yeah, I'm going to talk about this model that we've developed relatively recently. And as this is a kind of more informal seminar, please just interrupt and ask questions at any time if something is not clear. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to a lively discussion at the end. So this is work that I did together with Nick Weststraight, who is now at Chicago, and who has been a great collaborator for a really long time by now. And basically, I don't want you to necessarily read all this, but basically, as I'm sure many of you know anyways, there's many different definitions of wisdom. And basically, you could say that every research group that's working on wisdom has their own definition. And the definitions certainly have some kind of overlap, but they tend to also be quite different. So some of them focus on cognitive aspects of wisdom, such as the original Berlin wisdom model, which basically just said wisdom is expert knowledge, or Sternberg's model, which basically said it's tacit knowledge / practical intelligence applied for a common good in situations where different interests are in conflict, or Igor Grossman's model, which basically says it's an application of certain metacognitive strategies for the sake of also some kind of common good. So that would be models that are mostly about wise thinking. And then on the other hand, you have models that are more about wise living or wise being or wisely experiencing the world. And one would be Monica Ardell's model, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which basically says wisdom is a personality capacity that includes cognitive traits, but in the sense of this being a general interest, a general curiosity to learn more about life. So she's not saying that wisdom is really knowledge, but wisdom is the eagerness to gain knowledge about life, plus self-reflectivity, the willingness to kind of question yourself, plus compassion and compassion for other people and their needs. Then there's Rick Levinson's model, which is more like coming from a Buddhist tradition, which basically says wisdom is essentially about self-transcendence, about quieting your ego that always kind of tends to come into the forefront. And then there's other people, including ourselves, that have focused more on the non-cognitive or not so cognitive aspects of wisdom. And in some way, these things tended to be in some kind of conflict. So basically most people would take one or the other side in this. One reason also why there was some kind of competition for which model is the best is basically that there tended to be relatively low correlations between wisdom models, wisdom measures. So many of these different models have led to measures being developed from them. And then you would find things like the Berlin wisdom paradigm wouldn't be correlated any higher than 0.30 with any of the other measures, and even between measures that were basically based on non-cognitive conceptions of wisdom, you would find correlations that were below 0.30. So you would basically say this doesn't look like two measures measuring the same thing, right? It would be more like, well, the size of correlations that we typically find between somewhat different constructs. And so some people were saying, okay, this is different models basically competing. It's kind of a war where we need to figure out which is the best model and the model that wins, and then we all need to march behind the best model. Other people were saying, well, okay, let's leave all those different models out there, but it's not a great state of a field, right? When every model is very different and there's basically low correlations between measures. It makes you wonder if the thing that you want to measure even really exists, right? But then we found something that was actually quite a surprise, and we found it kind of more or less coincidentally. We did a study where we were trying to develop a new approach to looking at wisdom. This was already 10 years ago. By asking people about experiences from their own life. So we basically interviewed our participants about a difficult conflict from their life, and we asked them to reflect on what happened at the time, whether they've learned something from it, about their own emotions and the emotions of the other person involved in the conflict. So we asked them a number of questions because our assumption was that you can see wisdom in how people reflect on past events. And what we did, just basically to try things out, was we used two different interviews. One was about a conflict, and the other was more broadly about a difficult life experience. So people were first asked to make a little list of difficult conflicts they had had, and another list of difficult life experiences. And then we asked them to talk about each of these events and ask them those interview questions. So basically, what we did then was we coded and rated those interview transcripts for all kinds of different wisdom components. Basically, we derived some rating guidelines from the three-dimensional wisdom model, the 3 personality components. We also coded for the components of the Berlin wisdom paradigm, which focuses on cognitive aspects of wisdom. We used ratings for our own MORE model and for the Bremen wisdom paradigm, which is also cognitive, but on the personal wisdom side. And what we found was, when we looked at the correlations between all those different ratings within transcripts, we found much higher correlations, as you can see here. If you can see it, it's a little small on my screen. I hope you have larger screens. But anyway, what you see here is correlations around 0.70 or even higher. So basically, if you have a transcript of somebody talking about an experience in their life, and you want to rate that transcript for wisdom, it really doesn't matter very much whether you rate for the components of the adult model or the Berlin model, even though measures of these two models have much lower correlations, right? So basically that made us think, okay, there is something common in those narratives across all the different wisdom models that basically captures some kind of essence of wisdom. So that's, and then we also had lay ratings. That's another thing. We also had a number of students who didn't know anything about wisdom because it was at the beginning of a longer course. We had them rate those transcripts, and even those ratings for their personal conceptions of wisdom had quite high correlations with all of those different models, right? So basically we felt that, okay, there is something common, some kind of common core that manifests itself at least when people are talking about challenging experiences, right? And it manifests them regardless of which model you use. So that really started me thinking about, okay, what is this common core, or how do the different models all fit together? And that's what made us think, okay, maybe it shouldn't be a war between different models. It shouldn't be competition. Should be more like an integration, because maybe it's like the old story that you certainly know about the blind man and the elephant. They all can't see the elephant, so they don't have an idea of what the elephant as a whole looks like. But each of them is touching a particular part of the elephant. So each of them has a somewhat different idea of the elephant, and all of them together make up the elephant, right? So basically we were thinking, maybe the different wisdom conceptions are just focusing on different parts of wisdom, but they all fit together in a good way that makes a complete whole complex thing, such as an elephant, right? That's where the title of the paper comes from. And then our third important starting point comes very much from Igor Grossman's research, and basically is just the basic fact that I think all of us have accepted by now, that wisdom has a strong situational component, right? So all of us probably have been very wise sometimes in our lives and not so wise at other times. And we actually studied this in an early study almost 20 years ago, where we found that, yeah, most people can recall situations where they did something that was really wise. Even people who don't score particularly high in wisdom measures will be able to come up with this one thing or two things in their life where they really did something that looks pretty wise. And at other times, probably they did things that were very unwise. And then Igor Grossman has been running this whole research program, showing that basically even very simple interventions, such as trying to think about a problem in the third person as opposed to the first person, or looking at the problem from a distant perspective. There's also research from Ursula Staudinger and Paul Baltes, who showed that imagining talking about a problem with someone else, just imagining it, not really talking, can already make you quite a bit wiser in thinking about the problem, which also kind of suggests that there are simple strategies that basically tap capacities that we have in our heads anyway, but somehow we don't usually use them, right? Which also suggests that wisdom can vary depending on whether a situation motivates us to use those strategies or not. Another thing that really also kind of struck me in the same study where we did those two different interviews was that the correlation between the wisdom ratings of those two interviews was again much lower than you would expect, right? So you would have high convergence of the different wisdom measures within each of those interviews. But then when you correlated the wisdom of a participant when they were talking about a conflict with the wisdom about the same participant when they were talking about a different event, there would be a correlation again of only 0.30 or so, suggesting that all of us may be very wise in the way we think about one thing that happened in our life, but maybe much less wise in thinking about another thing that happened in our lives. And that was very unexpected for us. We only did those two interviews because we wanted to try out which one worked better technically. And we were expecting them obviously to correlate quite highly. So that also taught us that even within like the same person looking at two events from the same perspective at the same time, there might be major differences in how wisely we think about different experiences, right? So that also suggests that there's something to wisdom that's not quite trait-like and stable. And then another study that quite impressed me or surprised me was by Stephanie Thomas and Ute Kunstmann. And they had this study where they actually had real couples, young couples, discussing a problem in their relationship. And they used those videos. Some of them were quite emotional, as you can imagine, and quite exciting. They used those videos as wisdom measures. They showed them to other people, an old group and a young group, and basically asked them what the problem is with the couple, what the couple could do, how the situation might play out. And then they rated those statements about the videos for wisdom. And they found, and it was quite amazing, that the young people in the study talked more wisely about those problems than the old people, and quite stable. This was quite stable and consistent. And you wouldn't really expect that, right? You would expect that even as we know that wisdom does not always increase with age, you would think that old people have had their own experiences with couple conflicts earlier in their lives, even if they might not have them anymore as much as they age. But still, you would think people can look back at the perspective of when they were young and could talk wisely about those experiences, but they really couldn't. So there was a strong age difference, suggesting that maybe it's just some kind of cohort effect, like maybe they weren't wiser when they were younger about these kinds of conflict, but generally it's also possible that people actually lose wisdom about some kinds of problems as they move through life. The authors also found that relationship conflicts are much more salient to young people than to old people. They spend more time thinking about them, talking about them. So it makes sense that they would be wiser about them. But still, you would kind of think that older people might be able to get back into that perspective. So that also made me think, okay, you can, obviously wisdom is not just something that you gain over life, you can also just lose wisdom as you move on to other topics. And generally wisdom just varies a lot within people as well as between people. So wisdom has a strong state component, wisdom varies by situation, and that also kind of went prominently into our new model. So how do you develop an integrative model of wisdom? And we spent quite some time talking about, we could see kind of how the different components of different models fit into some kind of larger scheme that I'll show you in a moment. But we tried to have some good criteria for which components we actually wanted to include. Because obviously when you look into the literature, you find all kinds of qualities that are positively correlated with wisdom, such as well-being. There's a lot of work showing that wiser people are also happier. So is happiness a component of wisdom? Probably not somehow. It doesn't feel right, but why? And then also humor. Jeff Webster's model of wisdom has humor as a component. Yeah, also didn't feel quite right to us. We were trying to really figure out why we wouldn't think that humor is really a component of wisdom, even though it is certainly related to wisdom. It's hard to imagine a wise person who has no humor at all, right? So that was a hard one. Openness is another one. Feels closer to wisdom somehow, but why, right? So we spent a lot of time thinking about why in our minds we relate things to wisdom in different ways. The question is really, how can we decide whether something is not just a correlate of wisdom, maybe an outcome of wisdom or a predecessor of wisdom, or whether something's really a component in a strong sense, something that is part of wisdom and that wisdom couldn't exist without. So we tried some different strategies. We had 4 decision rules in the end. One of them was that we really made a strong point of looking into research on non-experts, lay people's conceptions of wisdom. There's quite a bit of research on that, and we tried to review this quite seriously. We obviously also looked into the consistency of our components with experts' conceptions, which is basically what the whole idea was, to use the wisdom models that are out there in an integrative framework. We also looked into consistency with empirical evidence. There is quite a bit of studies on how wisdom is related, for example, to openness or to well-being. We also looked at correlations between components of different wisdom models, wisdom measures. And finally, what was actually maybe most interesting to do was to do some thought experiments, such as, could a person have the capacity X without being wise? Could a person be wise without having that capacity? So could a person have high well-being without being wise? Here, the answer is a definite yes. We also found that in our research, people can be very happy, but not at all wise. In some ways, it might be easier to be happy when you're not very wise. Could a person be wise without having happiness? Here we find actually, and we also thought, you would think that a wise person is pretty good at being happy in their life. It's kind of, it feels like it is part of wisdom that wise people are also able to have a generally to be at peace with themselves and with the world. So you would say, well, a person who is absolutely unhappy might not be very wise. Would an intervention, and that was, I think, one of the, maybe the most productive one, would an intervention that fosters happiness also foster wisdom? And here I think the answer would be definitely no, right? It would foster happiness, but probably not wisdom. And that one was helpful also in thinking about humor, for example. Would an intervention that fosters humor also foster wisdom? We would have to do the experiment, but we didn't think so. We thought basically probably not. Whereas an intervention that would foster self-reflection, for example, would probably also foster wisdom. I mean, we'd have to do all these empirical studies, but just as a thought experiment, this was really helpful in distinguishing what we thought should really go into the model and what should not. Right, so that's what we did. And then we did, the reviewers wanted us to really make the evidence even clearer, which made a lot of sense and was actually a very interesting exercise. So what you can see here is only part of the paper. It goes on for, I think, 9 or 10 pages, where we basically reviewed in the first column here components from implicit theory studies of lay people's conceptions of wisdom, where we've identified different aspects that would fit into each of the components that we propose. In the middle, you have components from wisdom models that fit to the respective component of the elephant model. And on the right, you have empirical evidence on correlations between wisdom measures and the components we propose measured in other ways, or correlations between different wisdom model components. So basically, this is 3 kinds of evidence that we really kind of ended up having to sum up comprehensively to argue for our model. But that then ended up being, I guess, quite convincing. So this is what the elephant model eventually looks like. And I'm going to, as it's a little bit complicated involving 2 moderators, I'm going to walk you through it kind of slowly. So yeah, here's the elephant. So first thing is, we assume that wisdom mostly manifests itself in specific situations that require wisdom particularly. So we don't really need much wisdom to decide whether we want to take the bus to work in the morning on a particular day. We do need wisdom in situations that are a little more challenging, right? So what we need, where we need wisdom most, is in situations that are important, complicated, typically involving divergent interests. They might be divergent within ourselves. They might be divergent between different people. Anyway, they are kind of difficult to balance. Generally, most of these problems also tend to be emotionally challenging in some ways. And that's one aspect that sometimes makes it difficult for us to really utilize all of our wisdom, because when you panic, or when you get highly angry, then basically all the wisdom that might be somewhere in the back of your brain will not really come to the forefront, because you're not able to access it. So basically, this is the kind of situations we believe where wisdom shows itself most clearly, and where also the limitations of most people's wisdom become most visible. So we assume the starting point for wise behavior is obviously a wisdom requiring situation. And then the end product of wisdom would be wise behavior. And the question is, how do we get from here to there? And why do we so often not manage to get there, right? So why are we often not able to act as wisely as maybe we could theoretically in a real life difficult situation? So basically, wise behavior would mean for us to have an unbiased understanding of the situation, which is complex. We would, wise behavior would definitely be ethical, would be concerned for not just one's own benefit, but the benefit of everyone involved, some kind of balance, as Sternberg says, between different interests. And it would not necessarily mean finding the perfect solution, because obviously these kinds of problems don't always have a perfect solution, but it would mean working towards the best possible solution, and maybe having some kind of several rounds, feedback loops of going back and then improving the solution again. So wise behavior might mean a ton of different things, and it might not necessarily really optimize outcomes. Right, so basically, how do you get from the problem to the wise behavior? The problem, one of the main problems why most of us don't get there, is that we might get too emotional, might get too self-focused or narrow-minded, because the situation is so difficult. A wise person would be able to maintain a wisdom mindset, which would mean they would remain calm, they would remain caring for others, they would remain open-minded to other people's perspectives, compassionate, ethical, all those kinds of things that sometimes leave us when we most need them. So the question is, how do they do it? Why are some people able to maintain this calm mindset even when, yeah, everything's exploding around them? And basically, here is where we believe the non-cognitive components of wisdom come in. So that would be things like traits. This would be trait-like things that basically some people just have at a higher level than other people. And basically, we have three main non-cognitive components, which each include some subcomponents. The first would be the exploratory orientation, which would basically mean that a wise person goes into one of those challenging problems with a desire for really understanding the problem. They don't want to just win the argument. They don't just want to be right. They just want to really understand what's going on. And you may know people like this. I know some people who I find quite fascinating in this respect, because they really, even if things are really difficult, they are just really in a way fascinated by what's happening, right? They really think about, wow, this is so interesting. How can I react like this in this situation? So they are really curious about those difficult questions of human life. And that kind of goes along with being very open-minded, being really interested in different perspectives, interested in understanding why other people perceive the same situation so differently, interested in experiences that can broaden their perspective in all kinds of ways, and also, of course, interested in their own inner experience, right? So willing to look into themselves and see why their reaction is different from what they would expect or whatever. So that would be the exploratory orientation component. Then we have the concern for others component, which basically includes empathic concern in the sense of seeing how others feel and actually caring about how they feel, right? So being able to identify other people's emotions and also experiencing sympathy, not just using their knowledge of other people's feelings to basically manipulate them, but really wanting to help them, to support them, which goes along on a less emotional level with a general orientation toward the common good, right? So wise people are usually concerned for something larger than themselves. They basically also don't care just about the few people who are close to them or their own in-group. They really basically care about like the whole world, humanity, maybe other animals as well, right? And the third non-cognitive component would be emotion regulation. Wise people just being really good at regulating their emotions and maintaining emotional balance, even when things get really, really exciting and challenging. So these three non-cognitive components would basically, if you are high in these three traits, you would be able to remain in this wisdom mindset, even if things are really, really difficult. And here I assume if you're familiar with other wisdom models, I suppose you can see how different components from different models went into these three broad components. Right, so if a person is able to remain in this mindset, then comes the second moderator, and the second moderator basically is that only if you are in a mindset like this, you are able to fully access your cognitive components of wisdom. So you might have a lot of knowledge about life, you might be very skilled at thinking about issues in a complex way, you might be good at self-reflection, but only if you can fully use these different components of wisdom, because you are in a mindset that allows you to access them, you will be able to reason wisely about the problem. And that's something that, well, I experience regularly in my life, and some other people may also have experienced. So basically here are the cognitive components. The first one is knowledge. Most people believe that wise people have a lot of knowledge about life, right? They've learned a lot of things, both from their own experiences and from the experiences of others, from observing things, maybe from reading books. They just know a lot about life and about people, not just themselves, but about other people and about differences between people. And they also have a lot of knowledge about themselves. They especially know things about their limitations, their own limitations, their blind spots. They might know that sometimes they don't want to see certain things, that they have certain biases, that they have certain weaknesses. And this knowledge obviously also helps them in trying to think about situations as objectively as possible. And that goes closely along with their metacognitive capacities, which basically includes, on the one hand, a general awareness just of the limitations of one's own control, of one's own knowledge, of the predictability of what's going to happen. So wise individuals know perfectly well how much they don't know and how much they cannot control. And they are also very much aware of the divergence, the differences between people, right? How different people experience things in different ways, appreciate different things, just have very different worldviews, perspectives, goals, whatever, and how these different, there's no good and bad worldviews, but things that are just basically shaped by experiences and life contexts, right? So that also implies a lot of awareness of the legitimacy of different perspectives. And all that, I guess, also feeds into self-reflection, meaning that wise individuals are also good at kind of monitoring themselves, even in complicated situations, and trying to overcome the biases they have. So they are aware of their own emotions, they are looking at them, but they don't let them necessarily guide themselves. Okay, so if you are in the mindset that enables you to fully use your amount of these wisdom-related cognitive capacities, then obviously how wisely you can really reason depends on the amount of these capacities that you have. So that's again a trait, traits that feed into actual wise reasoning. And then if people are able to reason very wisely about the problem, then we just basically predict they are also going to act wisely. This is one aspect of the model that is generally criticized by Bob Sternberg, who says that we don't always act wisely just because we know what would be the wise thing to do. And I generally very much agree with that, even though I believe that if a person fulfills everything that this model basically requires, then they would also have a high consistency between their reasoning and their behavior, right? Because many of the reasons why we often don't do what we know we should do are also related to not being particularly wise, right? So basically, this was a short walk through an elephant. This is another way of putting it, which is more like a decision tree model. You have the wisdom requiring situation. So the first question would be, is the person habitually high in those non-cognitive traits, exploratory orientation, concern for others, and emotion regulation? And this is a very simple yes, no, because obviously in reality, this would be more like a continuum. But basically, let's say the person is very low in all these three components, then this would be, they would be in a wisdom hindering emotional state, and this would lead to unwise reasoning, which is another stupid dichotomy, and to unwise behavior. If the person is high in these non-cognitive resources, this would foster a wisdom fostering emotional and motivational state, and that in compassion with being high in the wisdom related cognitive components would then lead to wise reasoning and wise behavior. And Karuna, I see you have a question.
I do. Earlier in this presentation, you mentioned how based off of the incident that people are talking about, they could demonstrate wise and unwise behavior at the same time, and then hence is not related to their original state of wisdom. How does that tie in with you talking about wisdom, at least as far as this model goes, of being like a constant state, which you're measuring through multiple facets of, putting a few models together, when you also state in the same paper that, you might have different levels of wisdom depending on the situation. So how do those two come together?
Yeah, that's basically the, the idea is that, wait, let me maybe go back to the elephant. So basically the idea here is that a situation poses a certain level of challenge to a person, right? For example, that might depend very much on how much you are emotionally involved in a situation. The same person might act very wisely when they are not too emotionally close, because this is just something happening to, let's say, their colleague, right? And they are basically saying all those really wise things because they are fully able to access all of their wisdom related knowledge and thinking capacities. The same person having the same thing happen in their own life is a very different story, possibly, right? I mean, there's this classic Berlin wisdom task, which basically is a 15-year-old girl wants to move out from her family home immediately. What could one consider and do? And me being a wisdom researcher, I know, of course, what the perfect response would be. So I could give this very wise response if somebody presented me with this theoretical problem. I could also probably give this very wise response if some parent consulted me about their 15-year-old daughter. But having a now 16-year-old daughter myself, if my daughter were to want to leave our home immediately, obviously, as you can imagine, this would be a completely different story, right? So basically, one thing we're assuming is that any the situations might vary very much in how challenging they are to individuals, right? Depending on all kinds of aspects of the situation, which might mean that in some situation, a person might remain calm and caring, and in another situation, not so much. At the same time, people who are higher in those wisdom components, those wisdom traits, would generally have a higher probability of staying calm, even in situations where others might already freak out, right? So there's this kind of continuum, this kind of threshold in there. Does that make sense?
I have another question that kind of relates to this. And I'll continue with your analogy about the elephant. So, I mean, when I first heard the story, I feel like I had the same question I have now. I mean, you could have 4 blind men and they could be each grasping like, you know, 1 foot of the elephant each, and they all think they have a good conception of the elephant, and it kind of is like a tree. In this case, at what point are you like, okay, there's some sort of conceptual saturation across models, and if I put all of these models together, I'll get an elephant and not just, you know, my idea of a forest, which is what 4 trunks of an elephant would look like. Yeah. So how do you approach the idea of conceptual saturation, knowing that each one of them individually isn't saturated enough?
Yeah,
so to
no, good point. Basically, I mean, one good thing is they don't talk all about the same thing, right? So one thing is that if you look at the definitions, they do differ quite a bit, but obviously they might totally be missing the eye of the elephant, right? All of them might be missing certain points because the eye is too high up and none of them can reach up there or whatever. So basically the thing with wisdom is that you remain caught in this kind of thing that you can never prove that your model is really about wisdom, right? There's no way to do this because we don't, like Jason Swartwood has this cool thing about like comparing wisdom to, for example, firefighting. He says you can totally see if somebody is a good firefighter, and firefighting is a quite complicated thing where you make lots of strategic decisions about how to extinguish a fire best. But you can basically tell if they did the right thing because the fire is out, right? With wisdom, you have no such external criterion. What you can do is look at people who are nominated by others as wise, which will be totally relying on some other like blind people who basically nominate those wise people. You can look at, as we did, consistency of the model with all those implicit theory studies, right? Basically, so that's essentially what we were trying to do with those pages and pages that I was showing you. We were trying to show that basically, on the one hand, everything that we have in the model is consistent with some other research, but also that basically everything or almost everything that other people have proposed as parts of wisdom are part of the model, right? But no, I totally agree with you that we might still all be missing some very important component, right? And there's no way, I guess, around that. I would tend to think that at least from a psychological perspective, which is also, I think, a limitation in a way, we are capturing the main aspects of wisdom. But yeah, this is just basically probably my own blindness and the part of the elephant that I've been touching by now. I mean, another thing
that's wisdom there as well, knowing what part of the elephant you're touching. So yeah, thank you.
Right. Okay. So maybe I'm just, okay, here come the limitations. So basically, again, okay, this is exactly what I was just saying. The general problem of how do you prove that your model is about wisdom, right? And we can all kind of, it always remains circular, right? I can relate it to other people's models. I can relate it to evidence that has been collected using those other people's models. I can try to relate it to lay people's conceptions. But yeah, it always remains kind of limited. It is complex. It has this double moderator thing. So some reviewers also argued that you can really not, or it's very hard to test this whole model at once in a study, which is also something we're not really proposing. We're proposing to test the different parts. But at the same time, it's also too simple because, for example, Justin Brienza showed, and this is a very, very convincing point, that actually the cognitive components tend to feed back or can feed back into the non-cognitive components. So people who are higher in the cognitive components are also better at regulating their emotions. And in our model, obviously the emotion regulation comes first, and then you kind of are able to access your cognitive components. So basically, all of these components are related in even more complex ways. Another the limitation is that there's unfortunately still very little evidence on actual real life wise behavior. And I would love to do a study where I actually put people into real life like situations and look like what they really do. We've always wanted to do an advice giving study with real life problems, people having real problems, and then we ask people to give advice to them. Never got the money to do that. It also just covers basically the limited situation of being in this kind of challenging type of problem that I described, but wise people definitely also live wisely in other ways, as we found in other studies. And maybe even most importantly, it's very Western centered. It's centered where the wisdom conceptions that we have are centered, which is basically where most research, I guess, most psychological research is centered these days, which is in a Western basically focus. And we've seen in different studies, and Ali has done some work in this direction as well, obviously, that, yeah, this is just a Western model of wisdom. This is a Western elephant, basically. And there might be different emphasis on different components. Some components might be more important in other cultures, and there might also be additional components that we're just not covering. Right. At the same time, the model does have some implications. One is that it provides a nice way to explain the situational variability of wisdom, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, Igor and other people have done a lot of research showing that wisdom varies. And you could now say, and it never really convinced me that people would have all this knowledge and all this experience, and then suddenly their experience would vanish, right, in a new situation. And so I guess here the model provides a kind of nice explanation that the non-cognitive components very much more, like the mindset you are in, the state of mind varies quite a bit across situations, and that basically determines the extent to which you can access your cognitive components, right? And that would be really quite consistent with all that experimental work. Also, in a relatively new study, Igor and colleagues have shown that actually practicing some kinds of mindsets, such as writing a diary in the third person about the things that happen in your own life over an extended period of time, can actually be generalized and become a kind of trait, become a kind of habitual way of thinking. And I like that a lot. I think this is really great because it also means that, yeah, you can change behaviors, thinking behaviors, ways of thinking in a way that actually habitualizes. Okay, another implication would be that it kind of accounts for something that also I always struggled with a little bit, which is a distinction that Ursula Staudinger has been making repeatedly between personal wisdom and general wisdom. And personal wisdom is when I think about problems in my own life, and general wisdom is when I think about the problems of a person that I'm not much related to, because otherwise it becomes somewhere in between. If I'm thinking about a theoretical problem of a 15-year-old girl, and I'm talking about it very wisely, this would be general wisdom. If I'm thinking about my own daughter, and I were able to talk about this very wisely, this would be personal wisdom. And obviously, we all know things like the stereotype of psychotherapists who are super great at talking wisely, at giving wise advice, being wise psychotherapists for other people, but who have very non-wise personal lives of their own, right? I'm not sure that this really exists very often. Maybe it's really just a stereotype, but I'm sure there is a difference between us thinking about other people's problems and us thinking about ourselves. Ursula at the beginning basically said that there could be both types of non-consistencies. People could be high in general, but low in personal wisdom, and also the other way around. And that has always kind of been confusing me, because I always thought when you're wise enough to even be relatively wise with respect to your own life, then I would expect you to also be wise with respect to other people's lives. So that would be being wise in one's own life and non-wise in respect to other people would be an unlikely combination for me. And so basically, we believe that this is not two completely different forms of wisdom that kind of might develop independently, but they are the poles of a continuum. And basically, the main point is personal involvement. Maybe I'm not sure if emotional involvement covers all of it, but generally the extent to which you are personally close to whatever the problem is. So basically, talking about a theoretical divorce of a theoretical person would be low in personal involvement. listening to a stranger on a train who tells you about their divorce might still be relatively low, especially if the divorce is in the past. Your friend being in the middle of a terrible divorce and you're trying to be supportive would be much higher in emotional involvement. Your daughter having a divorce is obviously even closer. And then I'm not even sure here whether one's own divorce or the daughter's divorce is worse. But anyway, in both of them, you would be highly personally involved. And the extent of personal involvement would probably make it harder or easier to access all those theoretical wisdom components. That's basically how the model could account for this distinction. Right. Okay, I don't know what I was trying to. Okay, yeah, exactly. This is what I was just trying to say. The higher emotional involvement is the more important, the harder it becomes to remain in the wisdom mindset, and the more important to do those non-cognitive components become, assuming that the cognitive components are kind of stable. Right, and then obviously the model has implications for designing better wisdom measures. And several people have been looking into ways how we can bring those wisdom models, wisdom measures closer to real life, because as I said, talking about theoretical 15-year-olds is much different from showing wisdom in one's own life. As I already mentioned, Ute Kunzmann and Steffi Tomatz used those videos of real people talking about real life. And Chao Hu used a paradigm where people were supposed to imagine giving advice to a non-present person, but still. And then obviously there's work by Justin Brienza that has been very important. This is something that I keep demonstrating to my students in every course I teach on wisdom. Fill out a wisdom scale generally, and they will all think they are pretty wise, and then fill out the same wisdom scale with respect to a situation in which you were recently, some kind of conflict or something. And then they'll be like, oh, wait, I didn't really take everyone's perspectives in that concrete situation. So looking into how people think about things that actually happened in their real life, I still think is a very good way to measure wisdom in a more ecologically valid way. Right. And then obviously there's the big issue of wisdom interventions. Yeah, basically it's fine if we say, okay, we try to teach wisdom related knowledge, but if people cannot access this knowledge as soon as they are in an emotional state, in certain emotional states, then we also need to help people to be able to utilize those wisdom components in the situation where it most matters. And this is just a little side note, but I would like to make it because it's also something that I'm struggling with. Basically, if we say that wisdom varies by situation, then one important aspect is that situational components, maybe structural and systemic components also determine how wise we can even be in a given situation. And if you think, for example, about, let's say, politicians, we all would love to have wise politicians, but for some reason we often don't get them, right? Because for all kinds of interesting reasons. We know that groups can make smart and probably wise decisions, smarter or wiser than even the wisest person in the group is, but only if the groups bring together different perspectives, and then if they also listen to each of those perspectives, right? And we know that tends to sometimes not happen in groups. Even if we have a group that is very kind of heterogeneous, somebody will take the lead and everybody will follow. So what you would really need is a culture where we bring together those different groups and we listen to each of them and the knowledge and the background that they bring with them. And that's just not what happens in politics, right? For example, and that's what doesn't happen in many other contexts. And that's what we would really need given the state that the world is in, right? What politicians have to do being politicians is they have to think in 4-year intervals, maybe 2-year intervals, like with the midterms in the United States. They need to say things that make them look good and make others look bad. They are dependent maybe on like all kinds of lobbies in the back. They are highly dependent on the media, of course. And yeah, so if there's just some kind of unpleasant situation, let's say climate change, for example, politicians will not go out and say, oh, we are in a terrible situation, we have to make all those, we have to do something about it. People will have to make individual sacrifices. Even if this is very true, no politician is ever going to say it. And if they do, they will not remain politicians very long, right? So we need to think not just about why can't we have wiser politicians, we need to think about how can we make systems wiser, right? How can we maybe implement something like, I don't know, a group of wise people from different backgrounds who are kind of consulted, who can be consulted by politicians. Why are doctors sometimes not as wise as they might be? Why do we sometimes feel like, okay, I just went to this doctor because I have this kind of complicated problem and I don't feel that I got good advice of any kind. How can, maybe this is just because doctors are paid for seeing as many patients as possible in a short time, right? If doctors were paid for actually really listening to patients, building relationships with patients, seeing their problems in their complexity, yeah, maybe they could make wiser decisions, right? So maybe it's often the system and not the person that limits wisdom. And this is something that I would really love to start working on more, how we could change this, how we could in different ways find better ways to change the systems and not the individuals. Schools are another example. I just taught a workshop for teachers about why school sometimes limits wisdom. Teachers, we would have loved to have wise teachers. We have some wise teachers, but they don't even get the chance to actually act as wisely as maybe they could because of reasons in the school system, right? So that's basically all that I wanted to show you. I just wanted to mention that a lot of people have been working in these projects, and I thank all of them. I also thank a lot of people I've been like talking to about all those topics and who have been very, very helpful in helping me think about them in more depth. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions or comments.
Thank you, Professor Glucke, and forum is open for Q&A. So anybody has any question, anything to ask, please unmute yourself and go ahead. Yes, Ankit, welcome. And
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So my question was regarding wisdom. So can we look at wisdom as a single construct, or do we look at it as a constellation or of domain-specific constructs that we cannot bring together, means statistically? So that was my first question. For example, wisdom might be different in different domains, in different cultures, and hence probably we may not have a single operationalization of wisdom. So I would just like to know the thoughts on the same.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's actually a really interesting issue because, I mean, as you've seen, even the elephant brings together like so many different types even of capacities, right? So this includes personality components as well as cognitive components. And that is only, I think, not a comprehensive model of wisdom. So wisdom in itself is something like, I mean, Paul Baltes used to say it's an orchestration of different things, different capacities that people have that come together to create wise behavior. And this is without even looking at differences between domains or cultures, right? So wisdom in itself is complex. At the same time, I think there is something that kind of connect. These things are all kind of correlated, right? They come together in wise individuals, and it makes sense that they come together. To me, it's not just like a random combination that some people will have both the cognitive and the non-cognitive components. It makes sense that they develop together, right? That if you are a person that basically cares about other people, you might become more able to take other people's perspectives on yourself. You might be more motivated to optimize things, not just for yourself, and so on. So it makes sense that they would come together also developmentally. I do think wisdom is domain specific to some extent, again, because I think we just have more knowledge about certain domains, right? As I mentioned earlier, this story of the people, of the older people who aren't quite as wise about young people's problems. This may be partly a cohort effect because those people may not have thought as much about conflicts even when they were young, but still it makes sense that younger people just being more immersed in talking and thinking about different kinds of interpersonal conflicts would have more wisdom in this particular domain. There's also certainly something like professional wisdom. We've done a large project where we interviewed teachers and managers about where they have been wise and unwise in their professional life. And we find obviously that there are lots of commonalities, but also differences. And then there's this large aspect of cultural differences. At the same time, I do think that some of these components, such as being aware of the limitations of one's own knowledge and control, are pretty general, right? Pretty domain general, and also pretty like culture general, universal, right? Caring about others more than, or just at least as much as about oneself, would be another thing. The self-transcendence idea that I would think is not very culture specific or domain specific. So yeah, again, I think it's a mix, and it also explains to some point why wisdom varies by situation, right? I can probably be a relatively wise university professor in many situations, but I wouldn't be a wise doctor or whatever, right? So I guess there's certainly the domain specificity, which kind of determines also the extent to which a person can be wise in a given situation. Hey, Justin, good to not see you, but hear you.
Hi, I'm coming. Hi.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi, it's nice to finally meet you. I've looked up to your work for a long time, so it's nice to meet you here. And
well, and actually you were one of the reviewers who finally enabled us to publish this paper, and thanks again for your great advice on that one.
I don't know if anybody's supposed to know that.
Well, you actually, I mean, you identified yourself at some point, so I thought it was okay.
Oh,
sorry about that.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, no, it's a great paper. I have so many questions, of course, but as I showed up late in the talk, I was stuck in traffic. Sorry about that. But as I came in, it was right at the point where you were showing the model, and I tried to look at it from somebody who's, you know, not a quant psychologist, not somebody who's like done this kind of research, and it looks kind of algorithmic, right? So with each stop and each arrow, it looks like, well, okay, if this, then that, then this.
Especially when you look at the decision tree thing, right? Then it really becomes this kind of,
Yeah, and so I'm kind of coming, my undergrad was in philosophy of AI. So it kind of brought me back there, and I was like, wait, can we have an algorithm like that? Does it really work like that? But then relevant to myself, of course, at the very end, you have wise reasoning. So is any of these things, like, are they really gatekeepers, or can you skip one, or do you not need it? I get asked all the time, can you be, so you can have some of these other components. Maybe you don't care so much about other people, but you really want to make a good decision in this context, and you use wise reasoning, and you go ahead and you actually make a wise decision that looks wise from the outside, right? Maybe it's Machiavellian. Well, I guess this is actually too many questions at once. Is there a gatekeeper? Can it be algorithmic? I don't see this as a SEM model that could be measured. There's probably too many
in
the model. But like, let's say theoretically, is wise reasoning the gatekeeper? Can you be wise without actually doing the wise reasoning, or is that just a coincidence then?
Okay, this is really this is really a lot. I mean, I do think, I mean, first of all, the emotional aspect obviously is a gatekeeper only in situations that are highly emotionally challenging, right? So when you're faced with a theoretical problem, or a problem of someone else, or a, I don't know, large scale problem that doesn't affect you personally, the emotional component will become less important, for example, right? So I would say that depending on the sort of problem, the relevance of the different components varies. If it's a problem about, I don't know, how a world government could make the best decisions to kind of tackle climate change, this is probably less something where you need your personal self-knowledge, and you just need a lot of knowledge about the problem, right? I do think that probably eventually the cognitive capacities are more like the gatekeepers, because I think often many people are able to remain in a reasonably wise mindset. I mean, one thing is obviously the goals you're pursuing. So I do think some of them need to come together. You might always be Machiavellian in things, but it also depends on the problem, to what extent this really matters. But basically, I would think if you don't have the cognitive capacities, well, yeah, you're unlikely to be wise. They don't have to be. I mean, that's another thing that I find very interesting. We did this study on wise decision making. I don't think they necessarily have to be like completely like in this conscious sense of I have all these arguments and I order them in some way. If you're a psychotherapist, I guess many of these things are quite intuitive because they've become automatized with, like, let's say 30 years of psychotherapy experience. So even then, I think it's not always on the completely conscious level, right? This would probably be more like a model of how people could try to be wise. The way it comes naturally to some people might still not be covered by this very well, but this is a kind of spontaneous response. I have to think more about all of the facets that this question involves.
Yeah, I think like with the idea that, you know, wisdom is a uniquely human quality. And if I'm a novice, so I'm like, okay, well, what's the thing that sets humans aside? Well, it's this ability to reflect and do these things. So ultimately that would be the gatekeeper. And well, for me personally, it's something that people can, it's a meta capacity to reflect on,
right,
on what those things are. So I was like, okay, like cha-ching, I can maybe measure these things. And for me personally, I liked your last comment because I think the setting is really important for wisdom. I think we do not realize how much organizations and social things influence our ability to be wise, but actually at the individual level, we can sort of assess these things to some limited degree. Obviously, there's no measure, self-report measure is going to be perfect. But I keep pondering this question, like, can you be wise without reasoning? And somebody at a conference, I'm pretty sure it was like Carsten de Drew or something, was because he does studies with army and like defense, or he used to anyway. And he was like, well, what about soldiers? Can they do the wise, can they do the wise thing if they are stopping to reflect? And so I think that's kind of like, well, how does that fit into wisdom? And I kind of got stumbled, right? So I was like, well, okay, maybe this is something that decision makers need, like the ultimate decision makers. But then that also, there's an element of time that's not built in. I don't feel like the time element is built into your model as well.
No.
What would you say about that?
May I add a comment here? I don't know if oh, sorry, let me close the door. It's making noise. So Judith, you can go on and I close the door and then I can come back.
Okay. Okay, I'm thinking about soldiers in the meantime. Okay, that's a really interesting one. Yeah. Yeah,
I just wanted to comment on that actually about, and it's what Justin says is that this is my perception of what Justin says. When it comes to things like organizational procedures and processes, and individuals have to follow some process and procedures like soldiers, right? So they cannot say anything different than what they are asked to. And no matter how wise or unwise you are, you just have to follow some direction from your commander. And that's a point that, I don't know if it is the right expression, wisdom gets paralyzed.
exactly.
And it becomes useless. So you are in a situation, you have to follow some procedures to make some decisions. And in those points, no matter how wise you are, so and the consequences of the decisions that you make and the actions that you take, it's beyond your control. And yeah, so that brings to mind so the element of decision-making autonomy is critical in wisdom.
So you should have some level of autonomy in making independent decisions to be able to show wisdom. Other than that, so I don't think we can refer to it as wisdom, or wisdom does not find a place to manifest.
That's exactly what we've been trying to study in that project we did with the teachers and managers. So basically we selected those two groups because we assumed that they would be very different in the extent to which they even have control about what they do, right? For managers, we ascribe a lot of control to managers. We basically blame them personally for whether they did or did not fail, whether they did or didn't meet some organizational goals. But then if the main goal of a company is basically to maximize profit, then there's not much room for wisdom in this, right? Then there's no way I can just basically try to do something that's good for all the people working in the company if that costs money, right? So basically there might be structural systems. On the other hand, the teachers are basically bound by whatever the curriculum, right? A math teacher is supposed to teach kids math, and if he sees or she sees that some kid is struggling with some personal issue, the question is it their job or not to take care of that, right? So in a way, in some way, we would expect them to see that and do something about it, but not at the cost of teaching the kids math, right? So that's a general aspect that I found interesting. To what extent does the system even allow us to show wisdom, right? And I was thinking the same things about soldiers basically not being expected to be wise, right? Because there's this whole thing about them being expected to follow orders. At the same time, like after here in Europe, in Austria and Germany, there's been this big discussion ever since the Third Reich, right? Was it right for soldiers to basically shoot people in Hitler's war, right? To kill people in Hitler's war, or would you have wanted people at some point to say, okay, I'm not doing this, right? Bob Sternberg would say there's always the option to kind of leave the environment if you can't change it, right? But still, obviously, there are situations that allow or expect more wisdom than others, right?
Yeah, and may I add one more thing? You referred to Bob Sternberg's model, saying that you either change the environment, you either leave, and what was the third one? Say there were
kind
three.
of, I guess it comes down to basically accepting it and changing
You
yourself to fit in, something like that, right?
You either accept it, you either change the environment, or you leave. But in soldiers' examples, you cannot leave the environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
So
right?
there should be a fourth option, and that's you just shut down your wisdom capacity, put it aside, you follow orders, and you just take actions. You are not given the opportunity to make decisions. So it is just take actions. And
I think that's exactly it. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly it. There are some situations and systems and organizations that ultimately prevent, like, so for the soldier thing, there was an episode that happened a while ago in Australia too. And I think it came to light like a year ago or something. And it was like, well, they're in this situation. You can never give them credit for being wise, but you can really give them punishment for being unwise and doing something that was
right.
bad, right? And I was raised in a very culty religion. There's not any possibility for anybody to be wise outside the authoritarian of what you do, and that is, I think, why they limit the choices. For soldiers, it's like, well, lives and resources and reputations and international relations depend on these things. It's like, well, that we only still have soldiers because we don't have good enough robots, like that, because humans are too fallible, right? But I don't know. But then when it comes to these really tight cultures and organizations, and like you're saying with politics too, like it's like, well, it's almost necessary that it's going to be unwise because you have to pander to
Exactly.
a group that hates another group. You almost have to be like kind of unwise to be successful.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the main thing that's kind of worrying me right now on so many levels. And that's something where I just really don't see. So I'm happy for any wisdom researchers to start working on this, right? Because the question is really, how can we, and I'm definitely not questioning democracy, but I'm questioning the way that democracy plays out these days with like social media, polarization going all the way, right? People becoming more and more radicalized simply because Facebook and YouTube play stupid videos to them, right? And then politicians having to play to this. And then those politicians who are best at playing to this not being the wisest politicians, obviously, right? So this is really creepy, I think, with all the problems that the world is facing. Yeah, and I don't see how we can, I would really love to see how we can kind of apply our insights about wisdom to the systemic level, right? Well, yeah, no definite response to this, I guess, but yeah, it's something I'd really like to think more about.
Any further question anybody has or would like to share something? Okay, so I think then we can conclude the session. Thank you so much, Professor Glucke, for joining us and giving this wonderful talk on this elephant model, integrative model of wisdom. Thank you, Professor Justine, Professor Ali, and all other faculty colleagues and faculty members joining across different institutes, and research scholars have also joined this seminar. So thank you so much all for having this seminar, for attending the seminar, and it was really wonderful discussion led by Professor Glucke. In next month on Friday, 26th May, we will be having Professor Zubin Mullah from TIS, and he will be talking about values and the role of values in as the essence of transformational leadership and how it is important for wise leaders. So I extend the invitation to all, and of course you will receive the details very soon. So thank you so much once again. Have a great day ahead and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.